Hi everyone, welcome. I am Lauren Turner and I am the Assistant Curator for the collection at the Ackland Art Museum. This is the second of our interviews with the MFA artists that would have been in our galleries had the spring gone according to usual plans. I am here joined by Sally Ann McKinsey. Sally Ann is a recent graduate, correct? You have fully fulfilled your obligations of the UNC Chapel Hill Master of Fine Arts and Studio Arts program. And she is here to talk with us a little about her practice generally and also about the works that she would have included had we been able to feature our exhibition in space vulnerability. A title that at the time we had no idea would be so spot on for today's climate. Sally Ann, you have got quite an interesting background that I don't get to see often. You have a 2010 Bachelor of Arts in Art from Furman University, but then in 2013, I see you got your Master of Divinity from Columbia Theological Seminary. And I would ask you more about that, but I have a feeling it may come up a bit in discussing your art, just from what I've seen of it. And you are also a founder, I believe, of an artist organization called Utilities Included that works as a small press and artist exhibition organization. And what other functions?
We host exhibitions in our home and founded it with my spouse, Drew Sisk, and also print small editions artist books. And so have been enjoying doing that in Chapel Hill while we've been here.
So you wear many hats. We're really glad you're able to take the time to join us today. I've been starting these interviews off by trying to plug the Ackland's collection because we are right next door to Haynes Art Center. And we know that a lot of you are able to avail yourselves of our collections during your 2 years in the program. And what I had asked you is what some of your favorite works in the Ackland collection are. I believe we have a slide of one of them, and I thought you might want to talk about that real quick.
Sure. So when I decided to come and pursue my research at UNC, one of the things I was really excited about was to be in the presence of the North Carolina folk pottery traditions and objects. And so I love the Ackland's collection of ceramics in general, but also particularly folk pottery from North Carolina. I have a background as a ceramic artist from like coinciding with my conceptual research. And so I'm interested in my work. I can tell you a little bit more as we go along, but I'm interested in craft and critical craft theories and the ways in which function plays a role in art objects and in which art objects are also social objects that are used in for functional purposes. And, you know, so functional pottery is kind of a huge influence for me in my conceptual performance art and sculptural work. So I really enjoy having those objects like this jug, which is Enoch Spinks Craven. The Craven family was a huge 19th century pottery family in North Carolina. And so it's just been great to have to be in this place and have those objects available.
Thank you. Yeah, I confess that sometimes when people send me their choices, they surprise me, and sometimes they seem spot on with what I'm seeing in your work. And this combination of form and function and that you see in a lot of North Carolina pottery, I felt spoke to a lot of what your work is dealing with. You proved to be one of the artists whose work was probably most affected in terms of how we perceive it by the current pandemic crisis. Would you like to go ahead and introduce your practice broadly?
Sure. So I'm interested in caregiving practices and cultural vernacular kind of norms that develop around the desire to heal or to give care in the midst of crisis or illness or death. And particularly from the perspective of the American South, I grew up in South Carolina, and so as someone who's been formed in, both as in American capitalism, I've been formed in biomedicine and the healthcare system, but I've also been formed in these other methods of giving care, like taking casseroles or giving cards or flowers. And in my background, before I came to get my MFA, as I was working on my own practice, I was also serving as a chaplain and a pastor for several years. And so in my role in clinical space as a chaplain, I was daily confronted with many different kind of modalities of giving care. And so both from the religious perspective or from the perspective of cultural vernacular norms or customs, and from the biomedical perspective in the sense of desiring to cure or to heal or to avoid death. And so this current body of work comes from that space of investigating the ways that multiple medical modalities converse and intersect and operate in the same clinical space. This installation in particular, the hope was for it to be an immersive installation, and I'm very grateful to the Ackland for kind of helping me to plan this so that it could be immersive, so that viewers could walk in and experience it in their own little space. Of course, that we weren't able to have people come in person, and so this image is kind of my my kind of iteration of this as a sculpture, as like a large-scale sculptural diorama. But what you see here, I'm interested in kind of making juxtapositions between material, process, and concept. And so the rug on the wall, for example, this is a hand knotted rug that I made that is knotted from hospital textiles. So operating room sheets, hospital gowns, and hospital socks. And the floor covering are quilts that are made from surgical towels, which in the Ackland, if you've seen the mock-up of the space, these quilts were planning to be placed on the wall opposite the rug, so that it was almost, I'm thinking of the labor that goes into making these objects, and thinking back to ceramics, as I had spoken before, and craft practices, and also thinking about gift giving practices that happen when groups of women particularly will form a quilting circle and make quilts for community members during times of transition or illness or death. And so the idea was that in the handwork that goes into these objects, we're able to think about the ways that communities attempt to respond to the biggest questions and traumas of life, and especially the ways that communities make sense of mortality, and the questions that are bound up in that are obviously huge and heartrending, and we're dealing with a lot of that right now, thinking of how to process loss. And it's a question I don't seek to answer as much as I seek to explore cultural dynamics that are all bound up in those big questions.
So this installation that we're looking at your diorama for, Code Blue, so named for the crash code blue when someone is in distress and they have to call in physicians throughout the hospital to come and attend. It's also sort of referring to this what I consider aggressively pleasant approach to decorating that hospitals go for, where they're always going for calming, soothing colors. And I think you even mentioned in your thesis to avoid being just blinded by sterile whiteness everywhere.
Mhm.
And I think it's really interesting from the visual arts perspective how much color is coming into play in your practice here. And I didn't know if you wanted to talk sort of about how you would see this working if you hadn't tried to sort of incorporate some of these found materials.
Yeah, so I do see these objects are functional objects like rugs, quilts, but I see them as color studies also. Like, for example, particularly with the surgical towels, these are reclaimed surgical towels, and so based on their wear, they are different colors. And we think of kind of medical textiles as blues and greens, and historically it was so that because in a surgery setting, if everything is white, it's like blinding. So the blues and greens were this attempt to provide some color, but now, like in contemporary times, I think it's often interpreted as a calming or soothing color, but also interpreted as cold too. They're cool colors after all. So it became a lot about color theory, really, in placing these towels together in a way that would show that the nuances of the colors, but I'm also deliberately placing them into compositional arrangements, as any quilter would do. The quilt that I have hanging behind me is one that I made out of scrubs. And so I collected these used scrubs and arranged them in similar ways to highlight the nuances of color, that, you know, each blue is unique. And so it was really trying to kind of make this clinical space soft, making sense of it by making it soft. Is this juxtaposition where we typically would think of it as a cold space. But I'm kind of trying to problematize some of those dichotomies we think about, and also like draw a relationship between the labor that goes into caregiving in a clinical setting and the labor that goes into caregiving in a social setting. So color played a huge part, and it, yeah, I hope that it just shows this kind of nuance.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that I was wondering, and I know people often just sort of gloss over and don't think about, but this idea that these materials that you've gathered do have meaning and functions, and just how you went about sourcing them. Like, how did you get scrubs donated or surgical towels donated? What's sort of like the elbow grease side of the art making?
Yeah, it's great that you bring that up, because I think that my process of finding my materials is often just as important as the making. I found the scrubs at local thrift stores, which was an interesting process because in this area, local thrift stores have scrubs because we have such a large medical community here, and several hospitals that are, you know, several huge hospitals. So it was interesting, and an interesting practice in the Triangle area, and felt very kind of local. But the towels, you can buy them reclaimed. So I didn't go to hospitals to collect them. That was one kind of barrier that happened, was that a lot of these things, you can't just say, oh, can I have all your used things, because they're biohazards.
And that's for the best.
Yeah, so that's probably for the best. But I think so these have been like laundered or professionally cleaned, or, whatever. But you can still see in that, the color shows how many times they've been washed, or, so I was interested in that. And the scrubs, the color shows how much they've been worn. So it was important that they had been worn. And, but yeah.
So looking at this sort of installation diorama, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the pillow, the plan was to suspend it sort of by like IV tubes.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Yes, yes. So I was thinking a lot about function, and this goes back to the objects that I chose, and thinking about all these textiles as vessels for bodies, for holding bodies. And so I thought a lot about pillows and beds as vessels, and supports for the body, and thinking about support both in physical, like functional sense, but also social support systems. Often support gets used for that as well. So I wanted to make a bed form that viewers could gather around and have the experience of gathering around, trying to kind of evoke this sense of gathering around a bedside. And to hang it is to support it in a way that shows those stress or tension points. And I hung it with oxygen tubing. This was a decision that I made closer to, like, after COVID was a real thing, that we were talking about ventilation and oxygen supplies and equipment. And so to think about supporting the body with medical equipment and the role that ventilation plays in supporting the bodily functions, but also wanted to kind of evoke this sense of a body being held in a more social way. And
I think, oh, go ahead.
The blankets that are used to cover that pillow are thermal blankets that are used in emergency room settings to wrap patients. So that was important, this idea of wrapping, holding the body, and those sorts of things.
Also in this installation, in what would have been, you were going to have these monitors on the wall with videos that are these really clever videos that I enjoy, where you've used an endoscopy camera to look into basically casseroles. And I think we have a still shot of those. There's again, yeah, and then we're gonna run the video, I think, from some of the cheese ball one. But as someone who's also raised in the South, I really enjoyed these, because I know whenever I've had loved ones post-op, it's always fun to see the casseroles that people bring and the wide range there is. But I think that these really epitomized, for me at least, this tension that your work is trying to navigate between this like very sort of warm, personable effort at dealing with grief and recovery versus these very sterile clinical environments. And I know we've been focusing on the Code Blue installation that would have been planned for the Ackland, but there was another installation that or body of work that you'd been dealing with called Anesthetics, which I think perhaps plays even more with some of that trouble of like well-intentioned, but without having the words necessarily to express those intentions. So I didn't know if you wanted to talk about that while we let the video play for a moment.
Well, I appreciate the way you articulated that, because those are the things I was thinking about. With the two installations, yeah, I mean, Code Blue is the installation that's making framing this clinical space almost as a holy space, or naming kind of the ways that biomedicine also is a system of belief with sacred objects like ventilators. I think of ventilators as almost sacred objects, the way that biomedicine frames them. So these videos, I've been really interested and done a lot of research in the intersection between food and illness and death rituals. And one of the ways that communities mark death and illness is the giving of casseroles. And certain families often, highly contextual, obviously, based on your own community or family. But sometimes families will have their own recipes that is a tradition to be given at certain moments of life. And so I actually use some of my own family's recipes that might be taken to someone who's ill. And I've thought in conjunction, simultaneously, I've been thinking a lot about medical imaging, and medical imaging almost as surveillance, and also social caregiving customs as surveillance in a way, in the sense of checking in on, in the sense of trying to, this very, very sincere desire to try to prevent illness, or try to make it better as much as possible. And so it was bringing together, like in a very literal way, the medical imaging and the social food giving customs, and almost using the endoscopy camera as this like way to investigate the custom of taking food, but also with humor. So I hope that there is an edge of humor.
They do.
Yeah. So, and I think that also food is, it when viewed in that way, looks very bodily. So, and with food, you know, it becomes part of our bodies. And so thinking about the body in that way. But I also think that humor is an important tool, and like in approaching mortality. So I do use humor, because a lot of times, and for those in caregiving professions, for myself especially, humor has been important in navigating all of these questions. So.
Well, I hope you don't mind being embarrassed, but on the subject of medical imaging, I actually, when I was reading your thesis, there was a line that really stuck out for me. And part of why we are doing this interview so late is because I just had emergency surgery. And the line returned to me at 2 a.m. while I was having tests done. But you write that as biotechnology continues to dominate clinical space, doctors study images rather than bodies, increasing alienation in clinical space and practice, which echoes larger cultural phenomena. And as I'm laying there knowing that you know, CT imaging technician can't tell me what they're seeing, they have to wait until the doctor has officially looked at it. I was just sort of ruminating over this in my morphine-addled mind. And one of the things that strikes me about it is what a powerful statement it could be just about visual literacy in general. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know if you ever find some of those tensions, this idea of studying images rather than objects, mm-hmm. ever present in the art world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't made that connection before, images and objects. My research has dealt with thinking about the ways that biomedicine is just wrapped up in American capitalism in this country. And so the ways that profit is engaged with all of this, and the ways that increasingly with biotechnology, of course, with biotechnology comes the ability to treat disease and the ability to care, and that's really an important impulse and an ethical impulse. But I'm also interested in this kind of the line between that and doctors caring for bodies in a different room from, you know, like, so you have the test done and the doctor is looking at the image of the scan and studying the image of the scan. And so biotechnology means that the more highly skilled doctors may be more physically separated from bodies. And so that's interesting. I need to think more about that image and object thing.
Oh, I completely understand. It's a big question and not one I would expect you to resolve within seconds of hearing it. It was part of why your choice of the North Carolina pottery really struck me, because I felt like those are objects that you really get their power more when you're seeing them and their texture, and you get the sort of the full experience, as opposed, they feel very tactile, as opposed to sometimes, you know, we're used to just seeing two-dimensional objects reproduced so much that we forget that they have this physicality. So it really rang true with what I had read in your thesis about sort of how you're approaching images and what they depict.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the medical imaging is just fascinating to me, because it does become so ingrained and so assumed and accepted, these medical images, and that as you think about like biotechnology, like laparoscopy, and the still it's very invasive, but also but still an image, you know, we always read as an image. So it's just something I'll continue to kind of think about.
That's great. On other things that I'm intrigued as to how you may continue your practice in the future, I know everyone in the world is tired of talking about the pandemic, but considering how it is very germane to your works, I'm going to ask you the question of, because of the pandemic, we're losing a lot of some of the traditional social support. Like, people aren't able to come by afterwards and visit. Like, you can maybe like leave a casserole on the stoop, but there's no seeing how you're doing and communion and things like that. And they're limiting people who can visit in the hospital. So I don't know how that's affecting like pastoral visits and things like that. And I didn't know if, now that this divide that you'd already been investigating is even more like physically separated, if that's a new direction you've thought about looking into in your work.
For sure, yes. I'm just the pandemic has been this very bizarre experience of a lot of the things I had been thinking about and trying to find language for are now writ large everywhere. And I'm interested in the visitation question for sure. It's a concern that I have, and just this continual kind of like push and pull that issue about, you know, social contact and everything. But what I've been thinking most about are also how the separation transforms our customs for offering support and care. And so one thing I've really been interested in looking into is the making of masks that has been happening, and thinking about handmade gift giving, especially because I was already thinking about these quilts and as these handmade gifts that are given that are functional to wrap the body, but also these very highly emotional attempts to do something. And it's a highly labored attempt to do something to help. And so the whole slew of people who've been making masks at home and giving them to hospitals, I think of as gift giving made by hand. I think of it very similar to casseroles, really, even though we see that as medical equipment. So I've been thinking a lot about function and object in that way, and also this whole kind of conversation about how functional the masks are as well, and whether they really help or not, and what function do they serve in helping those who give them, those who make them, and those who receive them, and all of the issues with that. I've also really been interested in, like I said, ventilators, and especially early in the pandemic, there was just so much concern about the shortage of ventilators, and the sense in which that is a really distressing and traumatic concern, that there wouldn't be enough kind of equipment to prevent death. The sense in which that shows a real uncomfortableness around death, and also shows just the loss of control that we have around mortality, but also the ventilators becoming these spiritualized objects that are revered So I've been thinking, so my next project is going to be quilting ventilator likenesses, like making
Oh, wow.
ventilator machines that are quilted. So this, and thinking about manufacturing and companies manufacturing ventilators, my first impulse in COVID was, what if I could make a ventilator from home? You know, what if I could put in my own hand labor and make these things? And so that's why the masks were really interesting to me. But what would it look like for me to make a ventilator? It would obviously not function. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe how would it function in some fantasy way? But does it function, if that's my impulse to try to help the situation? So it's just all wild and out there, and we'll see how it goes. But of course, all of these issues are so close to my heart because I've been thinking about them this whole time. And so yeah, I mean, and how we as a culture are going to process this trauma and all these deaths, and it'll be something that it feels like this is just the beginning of what I'll explore with it.
Thank you for that. And thank you for all of this, because I know it's big, not always happy to think about things, but I'm delighted that there are artists like you out there who are trying to sort through it to sort of find messages that are important for us to sort of heed and also continue from everything that we're seeing in the health system right now. To end it on a lighter note, as a recent graduate, I need to make sure that you're up to snuff. So I have a question for you. If you are taking macaroni and cheese to a post-op patient, should it be of the bechamel sauce variety or the baked egg casserole variety?
Baked egg. Sure.
Master of Zoom arts.
I'm all the way. Oh yes, I can do that recipe in my sleep. Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Sally Ann, for joining us and taking time out of your day. Yours was an installation that I was very sad we didn't get to see to full fruition, and it's often the example I give as to the vulnerability of the exhibition, because so often the graduating Masters of Fine Arts students are thinking not just in like a single object format, but an immersive experience. And that was a big part of why we never wanted to claim we were doing this show digitally, because it would have just been selling short these hugely rich ideas that y'all are putting out there. So thank you for walking us through what might have been, and I look forward to the day when it can be fully realized and we can see it in the flesh.
Yes, well, thanks for this conversation. This was really great to talk through it with you, and I'm really grateful to the Ackland for all the planning that went into this, and obviously we're sad that it didn't happen in the way that it was planned, but for me, I mean, with my work, it was just more to contemplate about the issues that I've been thinking about. So, and of course it was highly appropriate to postpone it. So, but thank you, and thank you for this conversation.
Thanks. Have a great day.
All right, you too.